There are images that hang on walls for generations, quiet and still, their subjects staring out from frames with the patient gaze of those who have long since departed. They gather dust in hallways and parlors, witnesses to births and deaths, laughter and silence, their stories slowly fading like the sepia tones that hold them. Among such images, there exists a photograph taken in the summer of 1892 in the modest market town of Ashby, Lincolnshire, England. It shows a wedding party arranged in careful formation before a garden wall thick with climbing roses. The bride stands at the center, her gown a cascade of ivory lace, her veil heavy and ornate in the style of the late Victorian era. Beside her, the groom stands tall and composed, his hand resting gently upon hers. A small bridesmaid clutches a bouquet of summer blooms, her face solemn in the way children's faces often were when required to hold perfectly still for the long exposure times of early photography. The scene radiates a kind of timeless serenity. The light is soft, filtered through the garden canopy. The arrangement speaks of order, prosperity, tradition. Everything appears as it should be. Yet there is something in the bride's posture, something in the weight of that veil that invites a second look. In 1892, photography was still relatively new, still expensive, still reserved for moments deemed worthy of preservation. A wedding photograph was not a casual thing. It required planning, coordination, the hiring of a traveling photographer who would arrive with his heavy equipment, his glass plates, his knowledge of chemistry and light. The subjects would pose for minutes at a time, unmoving, barely breathing, while the camera captured their likenesses with a precision that seemed almost magical. These photographs were meant to endure. They were promises made to the future, declarations that this moment, this union, this happiness would outlast flesh and memory. For over a century, the photograph of the Ashby wedding hung above a fireplace in a stone cottage not far from where it was taken. It passed through hands and homes, a family heirloom cherished but unremarkable, a frozen moment of happiness from an era long gone. But when it was scanned and digitally enhanced in 2013, when modern technology peeled back layers of age and shadow and time itself, what emerged beneath the veil was not fabric. To understand what was found in that photograph, we must first understand who wore the veil. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and in the spring of 1892 she was 23 years old, the eldest daughter of Marcus Whitfield, a tailor of some reputation in the town of Ashby. The Whitfield shop stood on High Street, its windows displaying bolts of fine cloth brought by rail from London and Manchester. Marcus was known for his meticulous work, his ability to cut a coat that would hang perfectly from any shoulder, his discretion regarding the affairs of his clients. Eleanor had grown up in the rooms above that shop, learning to thread needles and match patterns before she could read. She possessed her father's careful hands and quiet demeanor. Those who knew her described her as gentle, reserved, perhaps too reserved for a young woman of her age and station. She did not attend the dances at the town hall with the same enthusiasm as other girls. She preferred long walks along the canal, books of poetry, the company of her younger sister Agnes, who adored her with the fierce devotion only a 12-year-old can muster. Eleanor's health had always been delicate. She suffered from headaches that would confine her to darkened rooms for days at a time. She experienced spells of what the family doctor called nervous exhaustion, moments when she would grow pale and distant, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Her mother had died when she was 16, a loss that seemed to drain some essential vitality from her, leaving her more ethereal, more removed from the world around her. Yet she was beautiful in the way Victorian England most admired beauty, pale and fine-boned, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed always to be observing, considering, holding back some secret thought. Thomas Hale first saw her through the window of her father's shop in the autumn of 1890. He was 29, an engineer for the Great Northern Railway, newly transferred to oversee the expansion of the rail depot at Ashby. He was practical, methodical, a man who understood steam engines and timetables, who could calculate load-bearing stresses and fuel consumption with ease. He was not, by nature, a romantic, but something in Eleanor's profile as she bent over her needlework, the lamplight catching in her hair, stopped him in the street. He found reasons to visit the shop, to order new shirts and waistcoats he did not particularly need. Their courtship was conducted through the formal channels appropriate to their class and era. He wrote letters on railway company stationery, careful declarations of admiration and intent. She responded in a precise, elegant hand, her words measured and thoughtful. They took chaperoned walks along the towpath, discussing books and trains and the future, a future that seemed to stretch before them with reassuring certainty. They became engaged at Christmas of 1891, and the wedding was set for July of the following year. But as the wedding approached, Eleanor's spells grew more frequent. In May, she collapsed during a fitting, her body going rigid, her breathing so shallow that the seamstress thought she had died. The doctor was summoned. He examined her, listened to her heart, observed her pallor, and diagnosed the fashionable ailment of the age, neurasthenia, a weakness of the nerves brought on by modern life and feminine sensibility. He prescribed rest, fresh air, and a tonic containing ether and laudanum to calm her system. The seamstress, making adjustments to the wedding gown, noticed that Eleanor seemed to be shrinking, her waist growing smaller, her shoulders more pronounced. The dress was taken in once, then twice. The family attributed it to wedding nerves, to the natural anxiety of a bride. But the servants whispered among themselves. They said her skin had taken on a translucent quality, that sometimes when they looked at her, they could see the faint blue tracery of veins beneath the surface. They said her eyes had become strange, distant, as if she were looking at the world from very far away. Still, the preparations continued. The church was booked, the feast planned, the photographer engaged. On the morning of July the 23rd, 1892, Eleanor woke before dawn. Agnes, who shared her room, would later write in her diary that her sister had lain perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, and that when Agnes asked if she was nervous, Eleanor had turned to her with a small, sad smile and said she felt as though she were attending someone else's wedding, that it all seemed very distant, like watching a play. But the bells rang, summoning them to St. Helen's Church. The vows were spoken in the cool, stone interior, Eleanor's voice barely audible above the rustle of fabric and the creak of pews. The congregation would later disagree on many details of that day, but they all agreed on one thing. She looked radiant, ethereal, like a figure from a pre-Raphaelite painting, though no one could quite recall if she ever blinked. The newlyweds spent their wedding night in a townhouse Thomas had rented on Station Road, a narrow 3-story building with a view of the rail yard. It was a modest home for a modest beginning, furnished with pieces selected by Thomas's sister and approved by Eleanor's father. The wedding party had concluded at dusk with toasts and cake and the traditional seeing off of the bride and groom. Agnes had wept as she embraced her sister. Eleanor had held her close and whispered something in her ear that Agnes would never share, not even in her diary, not even decades later when pressed by family members curious about those final words. The house was quiet when they arrived. Thomas had arranged for a cold supper to be left in the kitchen. He lit lamps throughout the rooms, trying to make the place feel welcoming, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in his chest. Eleanor moved through the space like a ghost, trailing her fingers along walls and furniture, pausing to look out windows at the darkening sky. She complained of a headache, the same crushing pain that had plagued her for weeks. Thomas helped her out of her gown, unlacing the complicated fastenings with clumsy but gentle hands. She changed into a nightdress and lay down upon the bed they would share, her hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Thomas sat beside her, holding her hand, feeling how cold it was despite the warmth of the summer evening. He talked to her about the honeymoon they would take in autumn, a trip to the Lake District, walks among the fells, quiet evenings by the fire. She listened with closed eyes, her breathing slow and regular. Eventually, exhausted by the day's events, by months of worry and preparation, Thomas lay down beside her and fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. He woke to silence and gray light. Rain was falling, steady and soft, against the windows. The room was cool, almost cold. He reached for Eleanor and found her hand still resting on the pillow beside him, exactly as it had been when he fell asleep. But the hand was cold now, truly cold, cold in a way that sent immediate alarm through his system. He sat up, spoke her name, shook her shoulder gently, then more urgently. She did not respond. Her chest did not rise and fall. Her lips, which had been pale the night before, were now faintly blue. Thomas stumbled from the bed, nearly falling, his legs weak beneath him. He ran downstairs and into the street in his nightshirt, shouting for help, for a doctor, for anyone. Neighbors emerged, a constable was summoned, and Dr. Pemberton arrived within the hour, his black bag in hand, his face grave. He examined Eleanor while Thomas stood in the doorway, shaking, unable to comprehend what was happening. The doctor listened for a heartbeat, checked for breath with a mirror held beneath her nostrils, lifted her eyelids to observe her pupils. Finally, he straightened, removed his spectacles, and delivered his verdict. Syncope of the heart, he said. A fainting fit so profound, so complete, that the heart had simply ceased to beat. It was rare but not unheard of, particularly in young women of nervous disposition. She would have felt no pain, he assured Thomas. She had simply slipped away in her sleep. By noon, the news had spread through Ashby like the rain, soaking into every household, every conversation. The Whitfield family arrived, Marcus supported by friends, Agnes silent and white-faced, refusing to believe what she was being told. The house filled with the rituals of death, the covering of mirrors with cloth, the stopping of clocks, the drawing of curtains. A dressmaker was summoned, but when she arrived and asked what the deceased should wear for her burial, Thomas, his voice breaking, said that Eleanor should remain in her wedding gown. It was custom, he said, for brides who died within their nuptial week, for those who crossed from one threshold directly to another without pause, without time to truly become wives. The household staff moved quietly through the rooms, speaking in whispers, crossing themselves when they thought no one was watching, and at the foot of the bed, as the rain continued its steady percussion against the glass, the photographer adjusted his lens. His name was Henry Whitmore, no relation to the bride despite the similarity of names, and he had been summoned by the family to perform one final service. He said he wanted to preserve her beauty, to capture her one last time, before time remembered her as gone. Henry Whitmore had photographed the dead before. It was, in fact, a significant portion of his business, more reliable in some ways than photographing the living. The living fidgeted and blinked and complained about the time required to sit still. The dead were patient subjects. Post-mortem photography had become increasingly common in the latter half of the 19th century, a way for families to possess a final image of a loved one, particularly children who often died before any photograph could be taken during life. Whitmore had developed techniques for making his subjects appear at peace, almost sleeping. He would pose them in chairs, surrounded by flowers, their eyes closed, their hands arranged to suggest repose rather than rigor. Sometimes for infants he would have a parent hold the child, hidden behind fabric so the baby appeared to be resting comfortably. He approached his work with professionalism and, in his own way, compassion. He understood that these photographs were not morbid curiosities, but treasured keepsakes, tangible proof that someone beloved had existed, had been real, had been mourned. Eleanor's case was unusual in that she was still in her wedding attire. Whitmore had photographed brides before, but never a bride who was also a corpse. Never someone who had so recently stood before witnesses and made vows of eternal union. There was something particularly cruel about it, something that made even his experienced hands hesitate. He set up his equipment in the bedroom, arranging his camera on its tripod at the foot of the bed. The family had requested that Eleanor be photographed in her veil, the same veil she had worn at the ceremony. It was a beautiful piece, Brussels lace over silk tulle, embroidered with orange blossoms and secured with a crown of wax flowers. Whitmore carefully arranged it over her face, ensuring it draped properly, that it caught the light in a way that would translate well to the photographic plate. The room was dim, the curtains drawn against the rain, and he needed to calculate his exposure carefully. He prepared his flash powder, the mixture of magnesium and potassium chlorate that would produce the necessary burst of illumination. Thomas stood in the corner watching, his face blank with shock. Agnes had been led away by relatives, her sobbing audible through the walls. Whitmore worked in silence, making minute adjustments to his equipment, to Eleanor's position, to the fall of her veil. He had learned long ago not to engage with the bereaved, not to offer platitudes or philosophies. His job was technical, almost mechanical. He was there to operate the camera, nothing more. But as he worked, something caught his attention, a small detail, barely perceptible. He had positioned Eleanor sitting slightly upright, supported by pillows, her hands folded in her lap. As he leaned in to adjust the veil, he noticed condensation on the lace near her mouth, tiny droplets of moisture catching the weak light. He paused, staring at it. The room was humid from the rain, he told himself. It was a warm day despite the clouds. Moisture collected on everything. He reached out and touched the lace, found it damp, glanced at Eleanor's face beneath the veil, at her closed eyes, her still features, told himself he was imagining things, that grief and atmosphere were conspiring to create phantoms. He stepped back to his camera, checked his settings one final time, and ignited the flash powder. The room exploded with white light, harsh and chemical, burning away shadows, fixing the image onto the glass plate. The smell of sulfur and smoke filled the air. Whitmore worked quickly, covering the plate, dismantling his equipment, eager now to be away from this house, from this room, from the unsettling stillness of the bride who would never age, never change, never wake. As he packed his case, he glanced once more at Eleanor, at the veil that glowed softly in the returning dimness, and he thought he saw something, a shadow, a movement, a tremor beneath the lace. But the room was full of moving shadows from the rain-distorted windows, and he convinced himself it was nothing. He left without looking back. No one spoke of the movement behind the lace, the slow, trembling pulse that only the camera caught. More than a century would pass before the photograph was examined again, truly examined with tools that Henry Whitmore could not have imagined. The glass plate negative survived in remarkable condition, protected by the dry climate of an attic in a house that had remained in the Whitfield family, passed from generation to generation, along with furniture and letters and stories that grew hazier with each telling. By 2013, most of the family had forgotten the details of Eleanor's story. They knew she had died young, tragically, that she had been a bride, that there was a photograph. The house was being cleared following the death of the last Whitfield descendant, a great-great-niece who had never married, who had lived alone among the accumulated possessions of a family that had slowly dwindled into obscurity. Among the items catalogued by estate assessors was a wooden box containing dozens of glass plate negatives, the archive of Henry Whitmore's photography business, purchased by Marcus Whitfield after the photographer's death in 1903 and stored, preserved, forgotten. The collection was donated to the University of Nottingham, Department of Visual Anthropology, where such artifacts were valued for their historical and cultural significance. Dr. Alice Fenwick, a specialist in Victorian photography, was assigned to digitize and catalog the plates. It was meticulous work requiring careful handling of fragile glass, precise scanning techniques, and extensive documentation. She had processed dozens of plates, portraits of stern-faced families, children with toys, soldiers in uniform, the visual record of ordinary lives lived and lost. When she came to a plate labeled simply Whitfield Wedding, 1892, the image was striking even in its initial scan. The composition was unusual, intimate, showing only a single figure, a woman in a wedding gown and veil, seated against a backdrop of dark fabric. Dr. Fenwick noted the post-mortem indicators immediately: the too perfect stillness, the way the subject's hands were arranged with unnatural precision, the slight discoloration visible even through the veil. She had seen hundreds of post-mortem photographs in her research. They were a window into Victorian attitudes toward death, grief, memory, and photography itself. But this one was different. There was something about the veil, the way it obscured and revealed simultaneously, that drew her attention. She decided to enhance the image, to use modern digital techniques to recover details that would have been invisible to the naked eye in 1892. She adjusted contrast, manipulated exposure levels, applied filters that could separate layers of information captured on the original plate, and that was when she saw them. Fingers. The outline of fingers pressed against the underside of the veil, pushing up from beneath, creating faint distortions in the lace that became visible only when the image was processed with precision algorithms. Dr. Fenwick sat back from her computer screen, her heart accelerating. She zoomed in, examined the area more closely. Yes, definitely fingers, and not arranged peacefully, but tensed, pressing, almost clawing. She moved to another section of the image, the face beneath the veil, enhanced the contrast further. The eyes were not fully closed, the lids were slightly parted, and in the narrow gap between them, she could see the edge of an iris, a glint of reflected light from the camera flash. The pupils were dilated, enormous, dark circles that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She pulled up every detail she could extract from the plate. The fabric of the nightdress visible at the neckline showed slight disarray, as if the subject had moved, had shifted position after being arranged. And then she noticed something in the corner of the image, in the reflection captured on the glass globe of a lamp visible at the edge of the frame. A figure distorted but unmistakable, a man with his hands raised to his face in an expression of horror. Henry Whitmore, she realized, caught in his own photograph. His professional composure shattered in the instant the flash ignited. Dr. Fenwick spent hours examining every pixel of the image, cross-referencing with medical texts, historical records, accounts of Victorian burial practices, and medical diagnosis. She consulted colleagues, forensic photographers, experts in image analysis. Some dismissed her findings as pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, faces in clouds, meaning in randomness. But others were not so sure. The evidence, circumstantial and technical though it was, pointed to a conclusion that was both historically plausible and deeply disturbing. The image, once celebrated for its elegance and poignancy, once preserved as a memorial to a life cut short, had become evidence documentation of a tragedy far more profound than anyone in 1892 had understood. That the bride of Ashby may not have been dead when the shutter fell. To comprehend how such an error could occur, how a living person could be mistaken for a corpse and prepared for burial, requires understanding the medical knowledge and limitations of the late 19th century. The 1890s existed at a strange intersection of technological advancement and medical ignorance. Railways connected distant cities. Electricity was beginning to illuminate streets and homes. Photography could capture reality with stunning precision, yet doctors still struggled to definitively determine whether someone was alive or dead. The fear of premature burial was not an irrational phobia, but a legitimate concern grounded in documented cases. Throughout the 19th century, newspapers regularly reported stories of coffins opened to reveal corpses that had turned within their silk-lined prisons, hands torn and bloodied from clawing at unforgiving wood, faces frozen in expressions of terminal terror. Medical journals debated the most reliable signs of death, proposing tests involving everything from shouting into the corpse's ear to applying hot irons to the flesh to see if blisters formed. The problem lay in conditions that could mimic death so convincingly that even trained physicians could be deceived. Catalepsy, a neurological condition characterized by muscular rigidity and a profound slowing of bodily functions, could leave a person appearing lifeless for hours or even days. Victims of cholera sometimes fell into comas so deep that their breathing became imperceptible, their pulse too faint to detect with the instruments available at the time. Certain forms of epilepsy, severe emotional shock, even concentrated doses of opium or ether could produce death-like states. The invention of safety coffins, patented throughout Europe and America, testified to the widespread anxiety about being buried alive. These contraptions featured bells that could be rung from inside the grave, speaking tubes through which calls for help could be transmitted to the surface, flags that could be raised, glass panels through which the deceased could be observed for signs of revival. The phrase, "saved by the bell," is believed by some etymologists to derive from these mechanisms, though the truth of that origin is disputed. What is not disputed is that the fear was real, pervasive, and justified by regular occurrences of near burials interrupted by unexpected resurrections. Eleanor Whitfield's medical history suggests she may have been particularly susceptible to cataleptic episodes, the spells of rigidity and unresponsiveness her family attributed to nervous exhaustion, the fainting fits that left her cold and pale, the increasingly frequent episodes as her wedding approached. These could all indicate a progressive neurological condition. The tonic prescribed by her doctor contained both ether and laudanum, substances known to depress the central nervous system, to slow heart rate and respiration to barely detectable levels. If Eleanor had experienced a cataleptic episode on her wedding night, possibly triggered by stress, exhaustion, and chemical assistance, she could have fallen into a state indistinguishable from death by the diagnostic standards of 1892. Dr. Pemberton, examining her in the gray morning light, would have looked for breath by holding a mirror beneath her nostrils, for a pulse by pressing fingers to her wrist and throat, for the beat of her heart by placing his ear against her chest. If these signs were present but faint, too faint to detect, he would have reasonably concluded she was dead. He had no stethoscope capable of amplifying subtle sounds, no equipment to measure blood pressure or oxygen levels, no understanding of the complexities of the human nervous system that modern medicine takes for granted. He saw what his training and experience told him to see: a young woman dead of heart failure, tragic but not uncommon, especially in one of delicate constitution. And so Eleanor was prepared for burial. Her body was washed, dressed, arranged. She was laid out in the room where she had died, where visitors came to pay respects, where her family wept and prayed and made arrangements for her funeral. Hours passed, perhaps 8, perhaps 10, perhaps more, And during those hours, deep within her paralyzed body, trapped behind the thick walls of catatonia, perhaps Eleanor Whitfield began to wake. The implications are difficult to consider. If the enhanced photograph is accurate, if those fingers truly were pressed against the veil from within, then Eleanor regained some level of consciousness before Henry Whitmore took her final portrait. She would have been aware, at least partially, of her surroundings. She would have felt the positioning of her body, the weight of the veil, the presence of others in the room. She would have tried to move, to signal, to scream, but catalepsy, even when consciousness returns, does not immediately release its grip. The body remains rigid, unresponsive to the desperate commands of the mind. The ability to open eyes, to move fingers, might return in fragments, in tiny increments, far too subtle to be noticed by observers already convinced of death. And when Whitmore ignited his flash powder, when the room exploded with searing light, Eleanor's contracted pupils would have been flooded with illumination, her barely opened eyes capturing one final terrible image. The face of the photographer, frozen in the act of preserving her memory, the last thing she would ever see. Science can explain it, detail the neurological mechanisms, trace the cascade of medical failures and misdiagnoses that led to this moment. But explanation offers no comfort, no solace to the imagination that cannot help but follow Eleanor into that darkness, cannot help but experience the horror of waking to find oneself entombed in stillness, mistaken for dead, beyond the reach of help or mercy. And in 1892, beneath her veil, Eleanor Whitfield may have awakened to the sound of a camera flash, her first breath mistaken for her last. The photograph was taken on a Saturday. Eleanor was buried on Monday, July the 25th, in the churchyard of St. Helens, beneath a simple stone that read, Eleanor Hale, née Whitfield, 1869 to 1892, beloved wife and daughter. The funeral was sparsely attended. Thomas was sedated by Dr. Pemberton, too distraught to stand without assistance. Marcus Whitfield stood gray-faced beside the grave, supported by friends from the Tailors' Guild. But it was Agnes who drew attention, Agnes who had to be physically restrained as the coffin was lowered into the earth. Agnes who screamed that her sister was not dead, that she had spoken to her, that Eleanor had come to her in the night and tapped on the window of the bedroom they had shared. The mourners attributed her behavior to grief, to the particular bond between sisters, to the shock of loss. Dr. Pemberton prescribed sedatives for her as well, warned the family that Agnes was at risk of nervous collapse, that she should be watched carefully, kept calm, given time to recover. But Agnes refused the medicine. She locked herself in her room and began to write, filling page after page of her diary with accounts of dreams and visions and messages she claimed to receive from her sister. These diaries, fragile volumes bound in cracked leather, were discovered in 1911 in a trunk in the attic of the Whitfield house. Agnes had died the previous year at age 31, never having married, having lived a quiet, withdrawn life as a seamstress in her father's shop. The diaries were read by her surviving relatives and quickly hidden away, considered evidence of the mental instability that had plagued her since her sister's death. But for those willing to read past the accounts of spectral visitations and dreams, the diaries reveal something else, a young woman traumatized by loss, yes, but also by doubt, by the terrible suspicion that something had been wrong, that death had been declared too quickly, that her sister had needed help that never came. Agnes wrote that in the days following the funeral, she would wake in the night, convinced she heard tapping, the sound of fingernails against glass or wood. She wrote that she dreamed repeatedly of her sister, trapped in darkness, calling out, unheard. She documented every instance of something falling from a shelf, every door that opened without explanation, every cold draft that touched her neck, interpreting these events as messages, desperate communications from beyond the grave. Modern psychology would recognize these symptoms as manifestations of complicated grief, guilt, trauma. But reading Agnes's words written in an increasingly unsteady hand, it is impossible not to feel the weight of her conviction, her absolute certainty that Eleanor had tried to tell her something, had tried to warn her, and that she, Agnes, had failed to understand until it was too late. Thomas Hale's fate was no less tragic. He returned to work at the rail depot 2 weeks after Eleanor's death, but his colleagues noticed changes. He became obsessed with schedules and timing, checking his pocket watch compulsively, calculating to the minute how long various activities took. He began to question whether Dr. Pemberton had waited long enough before declaring Eleanor dead, whether more time should have been allowed, whether a second opinion should have been sought. He wrote letters to medical journals describing his wife's symptoms, asking if anyone had encountered similar cases, if there were conditions that could mimic death so completely. The letters went unanswered or were dismissed with polite condolences and assurances that the doctor had certainly done his duty. Thomas began to drink, missing work, neglecting his appearance and his home. In November of 1893, 16 months after Eleanor's death, he was found unconscious in his office, having consumed a fatal quantity of laudanum. His suicide note, preserved in the county records, consisted of a single sentence: "I should have waited longer." He was buried in the same churchyard as Eleanor, though not beside her. His family, ashamed of the manner of his death, placed his grave at a distance near the northern wall, where suicides and unbaptized infants traditionally were interred, separated from the consecrated ground of those who died in grace. Dr. Pemberton continued his practice for another decade, apparently untroubled by any doubts about his diagnosis of Eleanor's death. He died in 1902, well respected and mourned, his obituary noting his many years of dedicated service to the community. Henry Whitmore closed his photography business in 1900 and began drinking heavily. He died a year later of liver failure, his equipment and negative archive purchased by Marcus Whitfield, who stored it away and never spoke of it. The Whitfield tailor shop closed in 1914. Marcus had died, Agnes was gone, and there were no other children to continue the business. The house was sold to a distant cousin who knew little of the family history, who hung the wedding photograph above the fireplace because it was beautiful and old, and added a touch of history to the parlor. Over the decades, Eleanor's story faded into obscurity, becoming one tragedy among thousands, one brief life in the great anonymous mass of the dead. But the photograph remained, and decades later, Agnes's words remained as well, locked in diaries in a trunk in an attic, waiting. Even decades later, she wrote in 1909, 3 years before her death, "I swear I can hear the faintest rustle of lace whenever I walk past the portrait. I know what the doctor said, I know what everyone believed, but I was her sister. I knew her breath, her heartbeat, the way she moved through rooms, and I am telling you, she was not gone. Not when they placed her in that gown, not when that photographer came. She was there somewhere trying to reach us, and we buried her, still trying." The photograph now resides in the archives of the University of Nottingham, catalogued and preserved, available to researchers and students studying Victorian death practices, the history of photography, or the medical errors of the past. Dr. Alice Fenwick published her findings in 2014 in the Journal of Visual Anthropology and Medical History. The article, titled "Post-Mortem Photography and the Victorian Fear of Premature Burial, the Case of the Whitfield Bride," generated significant attention both within academic circles and in popular media. The photograph was reproduced in newspapers and on websites, always with the critical details enhanced and annotated, the fingers beneath the veil circled in red, the partially open eyes highlighted, the reflection of the horrified photographer pointed out with arrows and text. Debates emerged immediately. Forensic photographers argued that the artifacts Dr. Fenwick identified were simply distortions created by the enhancement process, digital ghosts produced by algorithms manipulating aged and imperfect source material. They pointed out that glass plate negatives could develop flaws over time, that cracks and degradation could create patterns that resembled intentional marks or movements. They noted that the human brain is exceptionally skilled at finding faces and meaningful patterns in random data, that we see what we expect to see, what we fear to see. Other experts were less certain. A neurologist who reviewed the case noted that Eleanor's documented symptoms were consistent with catalepsy or a related dissociative disorder, that such conditions were underdiagnosed in the Victorian era and could indeed produce death-like states. A historian of medicine pointed out that the 1890s represented a particularly dangerous period for determining death after the abandonment of older, more brutal tests involving cutting or burning the corpse, but before the development of reliable modern diagnostic tools. The case became a touchstone in discussions about the history of premature burial, referenced in documentaries and books, used as an example in medical ethics courses, examining the importance of thorough examination and the dangers of assumption. The photograph itself achieved a kind of dark fame, reproduced on websites devoted to Victorian mysteries and historical oddities, sometimes sensationalized, often misrepresented, detached from the real lives it once documented. Thomas Hale's suicide note was rediscovered and widely circulated, seen as potential evidence that he harbored doubts about his wife's death, that perhaps he had noticed something wrong, some sign of life that he could not articulate or prove. Agnes's diaries were eventually published in an annotated edition by a folklore scholar interested in Victorian spiritualism and grief practices. Readers disagreed on whether Agnes was documenting genuine supernatural phenomena or simply processing trauma through the lens of the era's obsession with spirits and messages from the beyond. But regardless of interpretation, her words resonated with those who read them, her anguish and conviction lending emotional weight to what might otherwise be dismissed as historical curiosity. The case revived academic interest in Victorian death photography, a practice that modern viewers often find disturbing but that served a genuine psychological and social need. In an era of high mortality and limited technology, researchers began to examine other post-mortem photographs more carefully, looking for similar signs for other cases where the subject might not have been as dead as believed. A few potential examples emerged, photographs showing subjects with slightly irregular positioning, with signs of possible movement or unusual expressions, but none as compelling or well-documented as Eleanor Whitfield's case. The broader impact of the Whitfield photograph extended beyond academic discussion. It forced a confrontation with questions that remain relevant even in an age of advanced medical technology. How do we define death? What are the boundaries between consciousness and oblivion? How much do we rely on appearance and assumption rather than genuine verification? The photograph became a metaphor for the fragile line between presence and absence, for the ways in which we can be wrong about the most fundamental questions, for the horror that lies in the possibility that what we thought we knew with certainty might be mistaken. Modern medicine has largely eliminated the risk of premature burial through the use of electrocardiograms, brain activity monitors, and strict legal definitions of death that require extended observation and multiple confirmatory tests. Yet cases still occasionally emerge of people declared dead who later revive, of misdiagnoses in emergency rooms and nursing homes, of the persistent difficulty in determining the exact moment when life ceases. The fear has not entirely disappeared. It has simply retreated, pushed back by technology and knowledge, but never fully extinguished. The photograph serves as a reminder of that fear, a window into a time when the dead and the living occupied territories less clearly marked, when the tools available for navigating between those territories were crude and unreliable, when mistakes had consequences that echo across centuries. Whether Eleanor Whitfield was truly alive beneath that veil, or whether the enhanced image shows only the artifacts of time and technology, may never be definitively proven. The evidence is circumstantial, open to interpretation, subject to the biases and perspectives of those who examine it. But in a deeper sense, the question of proof may be less important than the question of possibility. The photograph asks us to consider what we assume, what we accept without verification, what horrors might exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt. It reminds us that beneath every historical fact, every recorded death, every moment frozen in time, there are human experiences we can never fully access, suffering we can never fully measure, truths that remain hidden even when we think we are looking directly at them. The photograph has become, over time, something more than documentation of a single tragedy. It has become a meditation on the limits of knowledge, on the relationship between seeing and understanding, on the ways in which technology can reveal what the eye misses, while simultaneously creating new forms of uncertainty. In the age of digital manipulation, when photographs can be altered with casual ease, when seeing no longer necessarily means believing, the Whitfield photograph occupies an interesting position. It is simultaneously more credible and less credible than it would have been in 1892. More credible because modern enhancement can reveal details invisible to period observers, because we have scientific frameworks for understanding what might have occurred. Less credible because we know images can lie, because we have learned to doubt what we see, because proof has become a more complex and contested concept. Yet the photograph persists, hanging now in the public consciousness much as it once hung above that parlor fireplace, a frozen moment that refuses to release its hold on those who encounter it. Students in university archives bend over it, tracing the lines of the veil with their eyes, trying to separate fabric from fingers, trying to determine what is real. Researchers examine it with increasingly sophisticated tools, running algorithms that can detect the slightest variations in density and texture, building three-dimensional models from two-dimensional data. The photograph has been subjected to more scrutiny in the past decade than it received in the previous century combined, and still it keeps its secrets. Still it offers only questions, suggestions, possibilities. Still, beneath the veil, Eleanor Whitfield remains suspended between states, neither definitively dead nor provably alive, a figure caught in eternal ambiguity. There is a tendency when confronting such mysteries to seek resolution, to demand answers, to insist that the past yield its truths to the present's superior tools and knowledge. But perhaps the value of the Whitfield photograph lies precisely in its resistance to resolution. Perhaps its power comes from its refusal to be definitively explained, from the space it creates for uncertainty, for horror, for empathy that cannot be fully satisfied by facts. When we look at the photograph now, knowing what we know, suspecting what we suspect, we are forced into a position of uncomfortable proximity to a possible tragedy. We cannot save Eleanor Whitfield. We cannot travel back to 1892 and demand a second opinion, insist on more thorough examination, prevent the photographer from being summoned, stop the burial. We can only bear witness, after the fact, to what might have been, to suffering that may have occurred beyond the reach of help or mercy. This bearing witness is itself a kind of responsibility, an acknowledgement that the past is not simply an abstract sequence of events, but a landscape of human experience, that every date and name in a historical record represents a life that felt joy and pain, hope and terror, that ended in ways we can reconstruct but never truly comprehend. The philosophical questions raised by Eleanor's case extend beyond the specific circumstances of her death. They touch on the nature of consciousness itself, on what it means to be present in a body that cannot respond, to be trapped in stillness while the world proceeds as if you are already gone. These questions have medical relevance in contemporary discussions of coma, locked-in syndrome, and end-of-life care. They have ethical implications for how we define and determine death in an age when machines can sustain biological function long after consciousness has ceased, or when consciousness might persist in a body that appears lifeless. The photograph becomes a historical anchor for these modern dilemmas, a reminder that the questions we face today are not new, that previous generations grappled with similar uncertainties using the tools and knowledge available to them, and that future generations will look back at our practices and decisions with the same mixture of compassion and horror that we bring to the examination of Victorian medical mistakes. In the Church of St. Helens in Ashby, Lincolnshire, Eleanor Whitfield's grave remains, the stone now weathered and leaning slightly, the inscription barely legible after more than a century of wind and rain. The church still stands, though it serves a much smaller congregation than it did in 1892, and the surrounding town has changed beyond recognition, expanding and contracting with the fortunes of rail and industry and agriculture. Visitors occasionally seek out the grave, drawn by the story, by the photograph, by a curiosity that mingles the morbid with the historical. They stand before the stone, trying to imagine what lies beneath, whether Eleanor rests in peace or whether some echo of that final horror persists, trapped as surely as her image is trapped on glass. The church keeps a record book where visitors can sign their names and leave comments. The entries from those who come seeking Eleanor's grave reveal the range of responses her story evokes. Some express sorrow, hoping she did not suffer, choosing to believe the optimistic interpretation that she was truly dead before being buried. Others write angry condemnations of Victorian medicine, of the haste with which death was declared, of the failures that allowed such tragedies to occur. A few leave what amount to apologies as if their witnessing, their acknowledgement might offer some retroactive comfort, and some simply write her name, Eleanor Whitfield, or Eleanor Hale, as if the act of inscription might restore something taken from her, might return her to the realm of the remembered, the mourned, the recognized as having lived and suffered and deserved better. The wedding photograph taken in the garden on that July afternoon, the one showing Eleanor surrounded by her wedding party, the one where she stands veiled and still while life and celebration surround her, that photograph was not preserved. It was likely destroyed in the decades after her death, discarded by relatives who found it too painful to display, a reminder of joy that lasted less than a day, of promises that would never be fulfilled. Only the post-mortem image survived, the one taken in shadows and grief, the one that was meant to be a memorial but may instead be evidence. There is irony in this selective survival, in the fact that Eleanor's death image persists, while her life image has vanished. It suggests something about memory, about which stories endure and why, about the magnetic pull of tragedy and mystery compared to the quieter gravity of ordinary happiness. The photograph we have is not the one Eleanor would have chosen to represent her life. It shows her at her most vulnerable, possibly at her most terrified, if the interpretation is correct. It freezes her not in joy or love or achievement, but in a moment of medical failure and potential horror. Yet it is the only image of her that remains widely accessible, the only window through which most people will ever glimpse her existence. This raises uncomfortable questions about representation and legacy, about who gets to tell stories and how those stories are shaped by the accidents of preservation and the appetites of audiences drawn more to darkness than to light. If we accept the possibility that Eleanor was alive when the photograph was taken, then we must also accept that the photograph itself might have been one of her final experiences. The flash of magnesium powder would have been visible even through closed eyelids, even through the veil, a burst of searing white light penetrating the darkness of her paralysis. In that instant, if consciousness persisted, she would have known something was happening, would have tried to understand, to react, to signal her presence. The photograph then becomes not just evidence of her tragedy, but an unwitting documentation of her final moments of awareness, a preserved fragment of her subjective experience translated into objective data. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case, the collision between Eleanor as subject, experiencing her terror from within, and Eleanor as object, observed and documented and preserved by technologies and practices that could not perceive her subjectivity. She exists in the photograph as a thing, arranged and lit and captured, while possibly remaining a person, aware and afraid and utterly unable to communicate that awareness. The photograph bridges the gap between these states, while simultaneously making the gap unbridgeable, offering us access to the external appearance of her death, while forever denying us access to the internal reality she might have experienced. In the end, perhaps this is what photographs truly are, not simply memories frozen in time, but gaps between what is shown and what is hidden, between surface and depth, between the moment captured and the moments preceding and following that remain forever inaccessible. Every photograph is a veil of sorts, revealing certain truths while obscuring others, preserving appearances while allowing essential realities to slip away unrecorded. The Whitfield photograph makes this dynamic visible, forces us to confront it because the gap between what it shows and what might have been happening is so profound, so horrifying, that we cannot simply accept the surface and move on. We are compelled to look beneath, to enhance and examine, to question and doubt, to remain unsatisfied with the evidence before us. And in that compulsion, we honor Eleanor in a way that her contemporaries could not. We refuse to accept the verdict of death without skepticism. We insist on the possibility that she deserved more careful attention, more rigorous examination, more time. We acknowledge, across the distance of more than a century, that mistakes were made, that systems failed, that a life might have been lost not to natural causes, but to human error and technological limitation. The photograph asks us to remember that behind every historical statistic, every mortality rate, every cemetery full of stones marking 19th century deaths, there are individual stories of suffering and loss, some peaceful, some terrible, many lost beyond recovery. It asks us to bring empathy to our examination of the past, to resist the temptation to view historical people as fundamentally different from ourselves, to recognize that they felt pain and fear with the same intensity we do, that they faced the prospect of death with the same dread, that they deserved the same care and consideration we would demand for ourselves or those we love. Eleanor Whitfield was 23 years old when she died, if indeed she died on that July night. She had lived through childhood and adolescence, had learned to sew and read and walk along canal paths, had experienced loss when her mother died, had felt the complicated mixture of excitement and anxiety that comes with approaching marriage, had lain awake on her final night in her childhood home, wondering what her life would become. She had a favorite book, though we do not know what it was. She had a voice, though no recording of it exists. She had hopes and fears and private thoughts that died with her, if they died, leaving no trace beyond the few fragments preserved in family letters and diaries, the bare facts recorded in parish registers and medical notes. The photograph, for all its problems and ambiguities, is the most intimate connection we have to her, the closest we can come to her physical presence. And if that presence was not what it appeared to be, if beneath the veil she was still struggling, still hoping, still human and aware and desperate, then the photograph becomes both monument and indictment, both memorial and warning. Perhaps that is what photographs truly are in the deepest sense, not memories but moments that refuse to die. They persist when the people they depict have long since turned to dust, when the world they recorded has been transformed beyond recognition, when even the emotions they evoked have faded from living memory. They remain, insisting on attention, demanding interpretation, resisting the erasure that time brings to all things. The Whitfield photograph has outlasted the brief lives of everyone it touches: Eleanor and Thomas and Agnes and Henry Whitmore and Dr. Pemberton and all the wedding guests and mourners and everyone who saw it hanging above the fireplace for 100 years. It has outlasted the house where it hung, which has since been demolished, and the shop where Eleanor grew up, which is now a coffee shop unaware of its history. It has survived when almost everything else has been lost, and in surviving it has become more than it was, accumulated meanings and questions its creator never intended, sparked debates and research and emotional responses that extend far beyond the moment of its creation. It has become a kind of ghost itself, haunting the present with the past, refusing to be laid to rest, demanding that we look, that we question, that we remember. And in this, it fulfills a purpose photography was always meant to serve: the preservation not just of appearance, but of presence, the insistence that these people existed, that these moments mattered, that what happened to them deserves to be witnessed and mourned and understood, even when understanding remains incomplete, even when the truth slips away like breath on a cold morning, leaving only the faintest trace of condensation on the glass.